From the twisted realm of science and the darkest pits of reason comes chilling tales of godlessness. Bear witness to the unfathomable terror that is the Good Atheist.
Welcome to the GoodAtheist.net podcast. In our second week of Atheist Appreciation Month, my unofficial way of trying to interview people who I think are important to the scene, up-and-comers, the unappreciated individuals that make up the silent majority of the group, really, where you have a few people that you think are really dictating things, but it's the people behind the scenes. And today, I have a very special guest. His name is Peter Boghossian. If that name sounds familiar, it might be because you've listened to a couple of his lectures that I've put up on the site, or perhaps you've heard some of his podcasts. Essentially, he's sort of like really emerging in the scene, if you want, because he's had a couple great talks. One of them on the Easter Bunny, and ways that to try to demonstrate how critical thinking applies to really just about everything. He teaches philosophy at the Portland State University, and he basically teaches about critical thinking, epistemology, reasoning, so all that good stuff. So please welcome my guest, Peter Boghossian. Thanks for joining me.
Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Now, one of the reasons I really wanted to talk to you was I remember I was reading an article about some of the stuff that you do outside of just teaching, and one of them in particular was the way that you were using critical thinking, the Socratic method, apparently, when working with inmates. And I'm like, there was nothing else to this article except for that. I'm like, well, I'm fucking curious. What is that all about? How does it work? And is it effective?
That's a great question, and thank you for asking me about something else other than faith or God or religion. It's really nice to be asked about something in my primary area. So basically, the Socratic method is a way of asking people questions that help them come to conclusions for themselves. And so I ask people structured questions in a way to help them use a process to enable them to arrive at true conclusions. And the prisons it's a fascinating environment. It's a wonderful environment to do that. I have the curriculum. It's available free and online for anyone who wants it. And basically I run through basic, questions in history of philosophy, main figures in the history of philosophy, but at a very, very rudimentary level, and it's been designed to help people's reasoning processes. So you
don't just give them a copy of Sophie's World and send them on their way?
No, there's no reading. I can't assume that anybody knows how to read.
Oh, I see. So it's really that basic.
Yeah, it's that basic, and the idea is that the content can be conveyed through the pedagogy. In other words, you can get people to achieve a learning objective solely by your way of teaching or solely by the method of teaching them. So the communicative interaction that you have with people, it teaches itself is a way to teach people how to do something.
Now, I don't want to be the obvious turd in the pool here, but isn't it necessarily, isn't it possible that when you're trying to teach someone to reason, that all you're doing is just, potentially also creating an individual that now has the ability to rationalize irrational choices? Like, how is it that you can, just if given a short course on critical thinking, is it not possible that a person can still warp that and have still a fractured philosophy that is consistent?
Yeah, you're right. It's possible. It's absolutely possible.
How do you make sure that doesn't happen? What are some of the steps to make sure, okay, well, the things that you're reasoning, because you're working with inmates here, and obviously there has to be some degree of reconstruction about their role in society or their opinions about it. So where do you start with someone who's broken the law?
Honesty, and I know that people don't like one-word answers to things. Honesty. Nothing else is required.
Like, is it a litmus test in order for you to determine if a person is actually being part of doing the process, or why honesty?
Well, no, honesty on my part, not on their part. Nothing else is required. It took me a long time to figure that out. Honesty and then epistemic humility, or humility about what you know. The most important thing, hands down, without any question about it. And there is a mountain of educational literature on this. It's called pro-social modeling. There's a mountain of correctional literature on this. I mean, truly, it's not just subjective, it's conclusive. When I say men, the facility is an all-male facility. The men in these classes, I mean, these people have been beaten down by life. There's no question about it that they've had structural barriers, have had an unbelievable number of problems in their lives. And if you can model the behavior that you want them to emulate, that sets them on their course. And so I'm incredibly honest when anyone asks me a question. I'm incredibly blunt and incredibly direct. And I think that directly answers your question of how they can't come to rationalize things. Because I am the corrective mechanism. I am someone that they can ask, and I don't have all the answers. I mean, far from having all the answers. But they'll know when they ask me a question that they'll always get a direct and honest answer, and that can keep not so much that it keeps their ideas in check, but it gives them a little reality check as they work through these processes themselves.
Well, I was listening to one of the podcasts. I think it was on Philosophy News. I'm not sure. You can probably correct me there, but there was a discussion about the fact that in the soft sciences, we'll call them, there is a tendency for people to no longer say that's wrong, where it's just like that's interesting or so on and so forth, and sort of like stemming from that idea, does it come from really having to work with the pragmatic approach to philosophy of learning? No, you do have to put your foot down.
That's a great question. In fact, I just finished an article, and I submitted it just the other day about why is it that in the soft sciences the responses that students give are treated differently than in the hard sciences. You know, if I say to you, hey, look, I have, this is the example I use in the paper, hey, look, I have the influenza virus. I have a theory about how the influenza virus works, right? And this is my theory. And I say, blah, 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 here's how it works. And the students say, no, you know, that's not my theory. And you say, well, what's your theory? And you say, well, I have theory Y. Oh, well, what's your evidence for theory Y? I have faith in my theory. In the hard sciences, that would simply not be taken seriously. But in the soft sciences in the classroom, if someone says they have faith in their idea or what have you, that's the white flag of surrender. Everyone says, well, okay, they have faith. I guess that's the end of that conversation. No, I mean, we treat those responses differently in the soft sciences than we do in the hard sciences. And I'm saying that's wrong. That has to end.
Well, I mean, one of the things that I guess you had mentioned is that you're trying to deal with the way that people come up with ideas, the axioms that they rely on to tell them about the world and how they've reached those conclusions. And
some of those are false.
Right, demonstrably false. I mean, like you can just show that they're false.
Absolutely.
But you're still. I think that one of the things that shocked you, and you mentioned this before, was that you had you wrote an article dealing with this, very basic idea that no, if you have false ideas, then they should be called out for. You need to establish a framework that's logical and reasonable. And apparently there was a lot of controversy that surrounded that one article.
Absolutely astonishing. That the thesis of the article was, should use facts when you can. I mean, I can't even saying this to myself. I don't know if I should laugh or cry about how preposterous the response to this has been. That you should confront someone's beliefs with facts, with the best available evidence, and then you ask them to formulate their beliefs on the best basis of the best available evidence. But for whatever reason, if that falls in faith domain, then you ought not to do that. So, for example, if someone says, I have faith that the earth is X thousands of years old, or what have you, or whatever the faith proposition that one claims to believe, all of a sudden confronting that with facts is considered to be discourteous, disrespectful, impolite, violates diversity requirements, and the list goes on.
And most of all, arrogant.
Arrogance, yes. Who are you to claim? I mean, and then they pull out the Thomas Kuhn, oh, so science has been wrong so many times. How do we know you're not wrong?
Don't forget the people that are like, oh, well, science isn't properly defined, which is still a very true statement. But it doesn't mean that we don't have a very intuitive understanding of what science means and what science isn't.
Right, and I think that we can get to the heart of this whole matter by talking about belief revision. I think we can cut away through all this discussion and say, are you willing to revise your beliefs? Are you genuinely willing to change your beliefs? In science, you can look at the history of science, and we do this in the philosophy of science, we study this, is that people confuse an epistemology with a metaphysic. You know, they confuse. I was just talking about metaphysical naturalism the other day. People have these confusions in their head about things, and I think it's really important to tease these things out, but start with the fundamental question: are you willing to revise your beliefs?
There's something strange about the words metaphysical and naturalism together that seems to be like, is that not an oxymoron?
Yeah. It's interesting. People throw these different terms together. Discovery Institute is great for throwing these terms that don't go together.
Metaphysical naturalism. What? The meta-study of things that are objectively real. What?
I was just reading some fascinating stuff about that. But hey, let me just finish this thought before it flees from my head. So I think if you think about these communicative interactions, you can save yourself a ton of time by just saying to someone right from the get-go, are you willing to change your mind? And if someone says no, I personally don't believe that. I just think it's verbal behavior. But well, first of all, I have two options. It's binary, right? Someone says yes or someone says no. It's possible that someone could say maybe, but that, I think, falls into the yes category. So if someone says no, I'm not willing to change my mind, then you have to ask them, well, why not? You know, what is it about this? And then you can get them, I think it's not too difficult to help them see that having these fixed ideas or fixed beliefs is a hindrance if they want to find things that are true.
I suppose, though, you kind of have to be talking to individuals who have a desire to pursue the truth, and I don't really think that's. I mean, most people might say they do, but it's kind of like that effect where if you're polling people about certain things, the polls and the voting will be really different because what people say and what they do is really different. Like, and they may not even realize it.
Right.
And I think in this instance, it would be really difficult for you to be able to determine the difference. Like, if I talked to you and said, say you were very religious people and told you, are you willing to change your mind? I think that a lot of people who are still no's would say yes. And then even if you were to ask them the conditions that would be required for that yes, you'll find that those conditions are impossible to meet. Like, you have to disprove that God is real, which is an impossible thing to meet. And meanwhile, in their own minds, they've met the criteria of an open mind. They're like, well, I've already given you the way to get me out of this,
right.
Even though
right.
it's basically an impossibility. So I think that there's a large part of the problem, maybe even in a person's own delusion about their open-mindedness.
Right. Excellent choice of words on your part. I think that's right. I think, again, you know, we talked before this about simple ways or simple questions that you can ask to get to the heart of the matter. Look, here's the heart of the matter. Do you believe it because it's true, or do you believe it because it makes you feel good? If they tell you that they believe it because they're true, even if they're not sincere, it doesn't make any difference. Because then they're using language and reason, and then they're in the domain of language and reason and rationality.
So they step into your field, is what you're saying.
Yeah, I mean, the way they quote unquote win is, you know, either they grunt or they dance around or they don't say anything. And back to the prison thing, in prison, if someone doesn't say anything, the treatment is less effective. I mean, they can learn by hearing and by watching the Socratic method. But if you ask someone a direct question, you know, if you're having a discussion about whatever, if you're having God or faith or what have you, and you say, well, is it more important? Why do you believe? Do you believe this because you think it's true, or do you believe it because it makes you feel good? And if they tell you that they believe it because it's true, even if they don't actually believe it because it's true, then they've entered into the domain of rationality.
I would advise people that if something feels like, it's very rare that something will be true and feel good. I'm like, those are the rarities, and if that's one of them, you should probably be suspicious of it.
Yeah, should you feel good about all your moral beliefs? It's not clear to me. I mean, it's not. It's also not clear to me that if you don't have any beliefs that you're uncomfortable with, you're probably not thinking critically.
Well, I guess you're not giving yourself a real psycho analysis, a la Freud, even doing it on himself. Although apparently he could not see his own obsession with cigars, hilariously enough.
Yeah.
We're all blind about something.
Yeah, I think we are, but that gets back to the other point about, I said honesty, nothing more is required. I mean, we all have to be honest with ourselves.
I think we fear that.
I don't know. I think some people do, but I also think that there are ways to elicit that. That's the attitudinal dimension of this whole thing. I think that through the Socratic method and through certain ways of asking ourselves and others questions, we're more likely to arrive at conclusions that are reliable.
I guess at the end of the day, you really have to teach someone how to how to be honest enough to reveal the flaws in their own thinking. Because you can't, it seems to me as though pointing those out are fairly ineffective most of the time. That you kind of have to lead the horse to water, but he's going to have to drink it. And to some degree, I guess that's how I see your application of the Socratic method, as a method of just getting these horses to drink.
I was thinking about that as you were speaking. It's clear to me that you've thought about this a lot. It doesn't do any good for me to point out a fallacy or a mistaken reason. It's not productive. It doesn't move the conversation forward. I mean, I do with my students, but that's a different context. Ideally, people need to do this to themselves. They need to impose this systematized way of thinking and clarifying their thoughts. And you can summarize it very quickly by, giving a counterexample. Someone starts with a question. Well, Socrates says, what is justice? And justice is harming your enemies and helping your friends. And he says, well, what if your friends are actually bad people, but your enemies are actually good people? Then you'd be harming good people. So things like that, like literal ways to think about things. Again, you don't need a book. You don't need to assume anybody can read. All you need to do is to model this behavior, model this way of using reason to help people realize that they have beliefs that aren't true.
Is there part of this method that requires that an individual have, I don't want to say higher ideals, but a kind, sort of like maybe a certain degree of idealizing certain concepts? Like you mentioned justice right now, and I would say, well, if I was part of the justice system the way that most criminals were, I would have a very realistic, probably even unfortunately realistic view of how justice actually plays out, and therefore kind of feel as though my own definition of justice, I could either just reattempt to have this idealized version that the rest of us who were not part of the correctional fucking system might have, compared to someone who's actually gone through it.
I think that plays some part. I mean, this won't work on people who are criminally insane. So if someone is classified as criminally insane, all bets are off. But it will work on virtually everyone else. Here's a question that I've been thinking about for over a decade, and I've come to a conclusion. I will say that it's probably in the minority of the minority. Plato asks whether or not people knowingly do bad things. I don't think they do. I don't think they do, and I've talked to inmates in depth about this. It's really an incredibly profound question when you start to think about it.
Do you recognize your own wrong, kind of a thing?
Well, I mean, let me give you an example. I know someone who's in the hospital right now, and she's in her 70s, and she had a stroke, a heart attack, she had kidney failure, just a whole host of things. And I know that this is going to touch a nerve with some people when I say this, and my goal isn't to set people off in a certain direction, but my goal is to just help people conceptualize this problem and use this as an instance of that. So she was always overweight her whole life, and the vast majority, if not all of her complications right now, are a direct result of type 2 diabetes, which is entirely preventable. So when you ask the question, do people knowingly do, and it doesn't even have to be bad things in terms of a moral action or a moral idea. I mean, I wonder if you were to say, well, look, was it worth those years of eating dessert? Because now her family is suffering, right? I mean, now everybody in her life, it's not just about her. We live in networks and communities of people. And it's just so touching to see all these people come to the hospital and see her and who love her. And I also think it's the same with these guys in prison. I don't really think that they, to borrow a word from Highland, that they grokked what it is that they were doing. That's a really intense thing to hurt somebody else, I mean, we live in these communities. We're family. We have kids and brothers and sisters, and I don't think that the people who do this at the time they did it really got it, like really got what that meant to hurt somebody. Because you're not just hurting them; you're hurting all these other people, and you're hurting yourself when you do it.
Well, I mean, I guess if I take a look at, say, weight I think this is probably another good. I'm not going to say metaphor because it's not really a metaphor, but if you look at the way that people gain weight, I know that imagine someone who's trying to lose the weight that they've already accumulated. One of the big problems they have is that you not only have to sort of try to get your body to burn all this fat, but you also have to fight the forces that make that body more efficient at not burning it. In a sense, you're kind of combating against the demons that you've already sort of taken in. already absorbed, and it becomes just much more difficult. But, as speaking as someone who's recently gained a shitload of weight, well, not that much because I'm still skinny, but, and watching it happen, I realized that part of the reason that it was easy for me to do it is because, my willpower was sapped by all these other things where I felt that like for me, I'm going to have that soda, I'm going to have that chip. Is because there's all these other aspects of my life which I feel out of control, which I feel that it requires willpower and discipline in order to do, that I have none left when it comes to all the things that I should be doing in order to lead a good, healthy life. And I suppose that, to some degree, I don't want to put too much blame again on society, but only to find the solution, the fact that we are creatures of limited willpower. And I think that even that applies to the individuals who act in a criminal fashion. Like, lack of willpower is combined with the ability to rationalize your way into anything. These are terrible things.
Yeah, the Greeks called it akrasia, a weakness of will. And there's some interesting literature by this guy by the name of Bandura who talks about moral disengagement. Like, we know what to do, but we just morally disengage ourselves, so we don't do it. But that gets back to two things. The first thing is, how do we instill the qualities of reason and rationality in people? I strongly believe that it's through the Socratic method. And how do we, even further than that, these are attitudinal dispositions. Like, how do we get people to have a willingness to revise their beliefs? I mean, the more, I've thought about this question for years, and I really do think that people don't knowingly do bad things. They act in such a way, and I was actually just thinking about this again today, so it's funny it comes up in the conversation. I was walking down the road and I was seeing all these people smoke, and I don't like cigarette smoke, and I had to literally walk to the other side of the street. I think for some reason they love to hang out at the engineering building at PSU. And I was thinking about that in this context or maybe it is that I don't know something. I've talked to people who smoke and they say they think that it's worth it. And that's fine if that's really a rational deliberation or a rational calculus that one has entered into. But all of these things, like, let's say that every single thing you said was correct about, there are problems with will, et cetera, et cetera. Everything that you just said can be marshaled for reasons why we should value reason and rationality more and not less.
My problem goes back to what we were saying before, where we're not rational animal, we're rationalizing animals. And I guess my fear is that when a person has the ability to come up with ways of just establishing a rational viewpoint, it doesn't necessarily mean that viewpoint will be moral.
Absolutely, yeah,
I think it sort of speaks more to perhaps what's more of an intuitive element of humanity. What's still part of us that needs to be, it's malunderstood, but it's well recognized by people. Like, why are we inherently good? And there's a bunch of explanations. I lean more on the biological portion of it, and also kind of successful mathematical strategies that are eerily familiar to golden rules and things like that. But at the same time, I'm like, I feel like in any society they can produce evil that seems, at least entirely to them, rational. So I don't know if that rationality. It's kind of like Robert S. McNamara said, rationality will not save us. And I think that what he meant by that is the fact that you can have systems of thought which are consistent and still fundamentally wrong, like on levels that maybe I wouldn't be able to debate and explain to you because I know them intuitively as being wrong, but I don't know any way of de-rationalizing what you've already come up with.
I mean, Habermas calls that dark modernism, and I guess my first question would be that how does one know that those were principles of reason in the first place? I mean, were they really principles that someone sat down and reasoned through, or, to use your word, and people make this confusion all the time, were they rationalized? I mean, philosophers have done some fascinating work with this. John Rawls has done some great stuff. I personally don't know. I mean, I've been thinking about this question a lot. I don't know what to think. Ultimately, I have to say, I think I have just asked this at a lecture. I said I don't know. If I were,
how Socratic of you? Thank you.
Yeah, but that's one of the essences of, in my mind, what it means to think critically is, one, is to formulate your beliefs on the basis of evidence, and two, is don't pretend to know things you don't know. I tend to err on the side that we can use reason not only to make better societies and improve our lives, but to make more moral societies. And I think that there are some pretty good thought experiments that people have come up with, like Rawls, for example, and Sam Harris has tried it in the moral landscape. But clearly, without any question, we're better off at trying to make societies based upon reason than we are trying to make societies based upon something else. I don't know what else, because anything else would be arbitrary, right? Anything else would be subject to some other variable. But reason is univocal. Reason it speaks with one voice. It's ahistorical, it's acultural. It's kind of Peircean ideal inquirers.
I don't know if this is correct, and maybe you can obviously shed some light on this, but I always felt like that for us, rationality or reason itself almost seems like an impulse, perhaps not a very powerful one compared to the other impulses. Because we're a pattern-seeking species, I think that there is an intuitive part of us that seeks out pattern. I think this is why we see beauty as being something that tends to be symmetrical the same way.
Michael Shermer's done fantastic work on that, by the way, as you know, I'm sure.
It's difficult for me to just sort of say, like, let's pretend I was to make a scale of emotion, right, where I was going to say hate and anger and love can range from 8 to 10, and where does rationality factor in all these competing impulses? Is it low, or is it fairly strong, but in competition with so many other emotions that contradict reason? Or how do you think it's really sort of like, is there a strong impulse drowned out by other emotions, or is there a weak impulse, but sort of like all the other impulses themselves are usually fairly weak anyway, so you're only competing against a few? It's
a great question. Nietzsche has this idea of a will to power, a will to truth. You don't hear people talk about the will to reason. You don't hear that will and reason used very much together. I think that critical thinking and skepticism are hard work. It would be very simple. In fact, these are cultivated intellectual talents that need literally a lifetime of work. I think about this stuff constantly, and I never cease to be amazed at how frequently I'm wrong about something, or how I've misconstrued reality, or I've misconstrued a situation. So two things. One, that's why it's really important to have a willingness to reconsider, a genuine willingness to change your mind about a belief. The second thing, I don't think that rationality fits on some kind of scaffolding or some kind of hierarchical. I think that rationality is the thing that orders the scaffold and places the values on the scale. Rationality is the precondition for which, it's the fundamental building block that enables everything, societies, language, development, and even compassion and kindness.
Would you say then that maybe the best way to describe rationality in that sense is to call it a habit?
I think it should be a habit. Strong has a great book, A Habit of Thought, when he talks about the Socratic practices that. But I think it should be. I think that we need to habituate ourselves to certain features in our epistemic life. We need to habituate ourselves to thinking, how could my belief be wrong? Or, geez, have I considered this alternative? Or what's this possibility? But I wouldn't say that that's constitutive of rationality. I think that that's a manifestation, and not even of the impulses of rationality. I guess it comes back to the question of what does it mean to be a rational person? What does it mean to be, and this is a different question, but it's one that falls in the same domain. What does it mean to be reasonable? And then even a more rudimentary question, which, by the way, is answered by reason and rationality, is should I be rational? Should I be reasonable?
I like that question, but the first question you were asking, I would say that it would be difficult to answer just because so much of it seems contingent on the environment around you. Like, is a 13th century person who sells his daughter into slavery any less rational than a person today who attempts to do any of the things that seem socially acceptable?
Sell a kidney for his family.
There you go.
Okay. So you've started with difficult examples. You've started with moral examples, and those have to be, we need to work up to it. Let me give you an example. I have a ton of keys on my key ring. I don't know my key rings around here somewhere, but I have a ton of keys on my key ring, and my key to my office door is the same as the key to my department door. It looks virtually identical. So I needed some way to differentiate those because it only took me a couple times, and I literally, my day is on such a razor, I don't have time to figure out which key is which. So I used reason and took one key and placed it at the top of the key ring. So now every time I go to my office, I know exactly what key it is to use. I mean, that's a type of instrumental rationality. I mean, it's the use of reason to get what you want in the situation. And in this case, it's to pick the key that's going to open the door.
Well, I would say you're using more of a Roman room type of mimetic exercise, but maybe we disagree on that.
Okay, but that's, I mean, anything you want to call it, that's totally cool. But if we can agree that there are some principles like that that can either be more efficacious in terms of our time, that can be whatever principles one wants to invoke, then we can establish that there's some sort of a baseline and why reason is useful.
Okay, well then let's go back to the second question then. Why should I be reasonable? And it seems at least partially, let's say you use your example as for now, where you're suggesting, well, how do I determine the most effective way to open these doors without every single time having to use both of these keys and trying it out and getting the frustration and blah, blah, blah. Not to take one of those horrible Buddhist stands on anything, but I could just say, well, both of those things seem relatively unimportant. The desire to try to be more proactive and efficient with time is probably even a way to just squander it doing other things that could be done more enjoyably. Does it make life, does it make one more happy or just merely more productive?
Two responses to that. One, isn't it interesting that you use the very tool that you are criticizing? You use reason and then you use reason through words, and you articulated a criticism. And people have called this a performative contradiction. It's kind of like use reason to criticize reason. I'm cool with that. I actually don't have a problem with that. But it does show you the reflective power of critical rationality and the power that language holds. Look, it gets back to what you said before about should these things that we value be our values. And my argument to you would be the only way that you could figure out what values you should have, should you sell a kidney or should you sell your daughter or what have you, the way to answer that is not through flipping a coin. It's through sitting down and weighing the options and thinking through the consequences and really taking a sincere and honest look at what it is that you're thinking about doing, and then thinking about what is the best path to get there. And if you don't use reason to that, for that, it's not clear how one could accomplish that.
Well, maybe the big problem is no one is really aware that they're using reason all the time.
Exactly.
It's an automatic thing where now all of a sudden I'm saying, well, you're being reasonable in this case. Why don't you apply the same lessons of reason when looking at the things that you believe?
Yeah, it's amazing to me. I hear things all the time. You know, people have this. I just went to this excellent Paul